Wake up, buy here, pay here people. It's a beautiful day. Go grab yourself another cup of joe and say hello to Jim and Michelle Rhoads on the Buy Here, Pay Here Morning Show. Take it away, you two.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Happy to have you here on the Buy Here, Pay Here Morning Show, where Nathan Syme, dealer out of Birmingham, is sort of standing in for Michelle today. Michelle is under the weather and is being a trooper, kind of standing by to help out with some of the technical stuff, because I just always botch the buttons, Nathan. It's hard for me I can barely think about the stuff I'm supposed to talk about, much less remember which buttons to push and when. Yeah. So it's all good. We're happy to be here with you and have you to contribute to the conversation. We're just fresh off of our last V8 meeting of the month of January, where we recapped year-over-year data. And so while that information was fresh, seemed like a good time to bring it to our listeners and kind of give them a sense of what we have learned through that experience and kind of how the year has compared for a lot of our dealers. So I also need to make the announcement this morning that Nathan has become the COO of White Hat Way, and we're thrilled about that. He brings a lot of experience in a lot of areas in entrepreneurship. Ours is probably like the 14th business he's involved in now, but I exaggerate. But he's definitely involved in multiple things, and he continues to be a dealer. As you can see, he's in his location in Birmingham today, and so great. We're grateful, Nathan, for you to step in. You obviously bring a skill set and experience in areas that we really value and are going to benefit from a lot. So we're happy to have you be part of the program and part of the mission.
Yes, well, I'm excited too. It's great to be part of a team of people that have a mission and a value set that matches mine and matches, I think, many of the folks that listen. And so when you want to be a part of something, you want to be a part of something that you feel makes an impact and a difference in people, and not just something that's a bunch of busy work. So I'm very thankful to be a part of the team, and I feel good about everybody that has been that I've been introduced to, behind the scenes that help make everything go. So I'm excited about it. I'm looking forward to it, and we're ready to rock.
Yeah, good. We appreciate that. So we'll dig into the data. We've got numbers to talk about, and I just want to share before we jump in. I've got some additional detail on my side that you're not going to see on the screen today. But when we look at this pool of data, we're talking about a pool that represents dealers up to selling 1,000 a year. I mean, this is the kind of data pool that we're talking about. And in terms of numbers, these folks are selling. It looks like the total portfolio, or total pool rather, that we're going to look at today is in the $60 million of annual sales. So, you're talking about a pretty substantial pool of numbers. And it's just, I think when I do these kind of things, Nathan, I'm always thinking about some dealer who's, there's supposed to be 14,000 dealers out there. And if we think 500 of them are in a 20 group or a V8 group, then that means there's a whole lot of dealers out there that don't have a good point of reference. And those are the ones I think about when we have these kind of conversations and bring the numbers to give folks a feel for what's happening. And in particular today is to talk about how the year wrapped up versus 2024. And for us, that's where it started for V8. You were one of the initial beta members in the very first V8 group, one of the first 3 members, and late 23, and we kicked off data in 24. And so that's what really we're here to talk about, is kind of look over the numbers in comparison to that. Let me get that on the screen, and we can start to kind of share what it is that we're going over. So let me just kind of explain first that our volume. Our average in 2024 was 385 in this pool. Let me make sure I'm reading these numbers. No, 365. These numbers are kind of small, so I apologize. Because it's in document form, I think that's as large as I can make it for our viewers. But we were at 365 for an average for annual volume in 2024, and that was down to 346 in 2025. So that's small. It's a 5% decrease. It's just it's something to be aware of. We've heard dealers talk. You were part of that meeting last night, and then your own group earlier in the month.
Right.
And dealers are talking about it being slow. They're talking about a slow January right now. A lot of dealers talked about reduced volume, but basically what we're seeing is across this pool, it was only slightly down in terms of sales. And the dollars were down about 3%. So even though the units were down 5%, the actual dollars must have come up slightly across this pool, because the actual dollars of sales were down from just over an average of 5 million to about 4.9. So just a slight decrease there. And then we get into gross profit, which, we don't, in our V8 meetings, I find we don't talk about these numbers a lot, the sales numbers and the gross profit numbers. We end up moving on to kind of the collections numbers, and maybe that's
Right.
during the conversation that direction. But I think as we kind of take the wide view and look back, gross profit, you can see on the screen for our viewers. And this is one of those podcasts where, you really probably want to catch it on YouTube, because we are going to be referring to numbers on the screen. I'll do the best I can to recount those for folks who are listening by audio only. But I would just say on gross profit, we're talking about just a slight increase. Dealers, again, we said prices must have been up some. Gross profit looks to be up some, a small amount, $39,000 annually on average. So just about a 2% gain in gross profit. So pretty minor. And then we get into charge-off numbers. So obviously, you've been part of these conversations. You've seen the data from your own group, Nathan. We know that charge-offs for most of our dealers were up in terms of count and in terms of dollars.
Yeah.
Right? So I didn't bring together the count for today. We can bring that as part of a future conversation. But when we get it to net charge-offs year over year, that number was up. We were showing an average of 1.082 for 2024, and the number was 1.467 in 25. So, that represents about a 35% increase. So that's a pretty substantial. And we know that a lot of dealers had a pretty rough 24 as well. Right. So,
Right.
It'd be good if we had the numbers going back beyond that. But I can say that, it shows that is an increase. And obviously, we're working to try to help dealers find ways to get that number down. You heard some things in your own meeting, I think, where we talked about, ways to reduce that. But kind of as a dealer yourself, what is your aim when it comes to looking at net charge-offs going in next year? As we talk about in our conversations in our groups, the only thing we can really do to cut down net charge-offs is to repo charge off less and to gain some recovery. Obviously, net charge-off for us is the gross principal balance of the charge-off at the time, or of the balance of the account at the time that the customer quit paying and ultimately charged off. And then we would bring back against that the recovery value of the repos that we brought back in. And so that gives us a net charge-off. But so those are the only numbers. We can either reduce our charge-offs, we can charge off less, or we can get more recovery. So your thoughts on how we might move those numbers going into 26?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dealership conversations that I've had have been around working with customers more, being more creative in keeping them in the car. And so I think they're attacking just trying to keep the charge off from happening and doing a little bit more to do that, because obviously sales are down, right? Sales are down, repos are up, cash flow is probably impacted by that in some way. And so the idea that, whereas before you might just say, hey, no problem, I can charge this off and have a new customer walk in the door and, as soon as it's ready to go and sell it. Now that's not so much the case. So maybe we're not as quick to pull the trigger on a repossession as we would have been before.
Yeah.
And so, and the other side would be, do you repo quicker? That's the other thought. So do you protect the value of the collateral and go after it faster? I've heard it said by some dealers before, they want to trust the vehicle. They don't want to, they're not sure about the customer side. So
Right.
I think you could have a philosophy approach either way about which way you want to attack that. I think the V8 groups are a good place to have those back and forth conversations about that dichotomy. Do we repo quicker or do we work with them longer?
Yeah, and I think there's it's always been a thing for me to differentiate between a repo and a charge-off, because as you know, sometimes we can allow a customer to redeem if we feel like we've resolved the situation. Sometimes we're going to repo quickly, certainly early in the contract, we're going to repo quickly as a way of setting a tone and a measure of enforcement and accountability. And then if we feel satisfied that the customer has, kind of learned from the situation and will, behave differently going forward, then we could allow them to redeem and not have that result in a charge-off. And I think, the variable there is we look at, is the customer a flight risk, so to speak? Are they, if we put them back in the car, if we have GPS and we know we can recover the collateral again, then we're really, when we allow the customer to redeem, we're taking a chance on, will they disappear or will they damage or destroy the collateral? Because if neither of those is the case, then we're really not taking a lot of risk in agreeing to put them back in the car. And so this is part of what I think we have to differentiate between actual repos and then charge-offs, right?
Yeah, and I think dealers, for the most part, have a pretty good sense of that. Like, is this a customer that I trust, or is this customer that just had a momentary life event that occurred that caught, we all ask the same questions, and there are reasons to say yes and reasons to say no. And I think most of our dealers know what that is and have a good sense of it. But I do think if you repo quicker, the redemption is easier for the customer.
I agree.
The dollar amount's lower. And although the customer may feel a little offended because you repoed them quicker, right? You can also communicate with them, this is how we make sure that it's feasible for you to get your car back. We wait too long and the number becomes really difficult for you.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think the quicker we get in there, we also have to keep in mind that when a customer finances with us, especially for the first time, then all they really have to go on, besides what we told them on the day they bought the car, was whatever the experience they've had with other dealers in the past. If they finance with other buy here, pay here dealers, then they're used to doing business the way that dealer did business. And that sometimes we have to set a new precedent around that. And so that's part of what we try to do. So let's move on to net charge-offs as a percentage of sales. This is not a number I think about a lot, but I know from an accounting standpoint, a lot of CPAs and accountants would be looking at these kind of numbers. And so when you look at it like on the P&L or income statement, then we showed that in 2024, that number for this group was 19.4% of sales, and it was up to 27.7 in the year of 25. So, that's a pretty substantial change. I mean, you're talking about a 42% increase, and so that's pretty substantial when you look at it in that way. It's relative to how much business we're doing. And so now it shows up on our income statement, and this is the difference for a lot of our dealers in being profitable and not. So we talked in some length in our meeting last night about, the difference in profit versus cash flow. And so we're going to get to some cash flow numbers here in just a little bit, but I think, for our CPAs out there, and we love them and need them. And I think for us, we recognize, obviously, in the work that you and I do, Nathan, is like it's important to differentiate. Sometimes the timing of the year, and especially even with our lenders, and we need those folks too. And I think sometimes those dealers who had a rough profit year last year had a decent cash flow year. So, they had more charge-offs, which meant what? They recovered more repos, right? They brought back in cash value on those repos. And so they might not have suffered as much on the cash side. So we'll get to those numbers next. And the last one I show on this particular sheet is interest income, which obviously this one is a reflection of to one extent, portfolio size, the amount of, so if we're growing, obviously our interest income should be growing as the portfolio increases. But then the other part of it would just be effectiveness at collecting. If our portfolio can be growing, or portfolio could stay the same, but we can collect more, and the interest income number could move. In this case, we don't have that exact breakdown about how many of these dealers were growing portfolios, but we do know that, and I didn't say that at the top of the broadcast here, that I did extract dealers that, one, we have a number of dealers in V8 who didn't join in time to have their 2024 data intact. So we had to extract those dealers. And then we had a few dealers who acquired portfolios, pretty sizable ones, which would move some of these numbers that we're talking about. So I chose to leave them out of the pool as well. But when you see the interest income, we were showing that the average came in at 1.16 in, call it 1.17 in 24, and that number was up to 1.38 in 25. So an increase of about 18% year over year with this particular group and their interest earnings. So again, back to, you think you're charging off or your portfolio is shrinking. And so, it wouldn't have as much interest earnings. And so in this case, we actually did see some increase in interest earnings, which, we don't have enough information here, because the results are going to vary across these operations as to how they did what they did. But it is interesting to see that they did, in fact, increase that. We can go to the next slide, Michelle. I think I can do it on my side.
I would say that would make sense, right? If you have more delinquency and you are working more with your customer base, then you will naturally be earning or realizing more interest on each payment than you would principal, because somebody gets behind, their payment might go to all interest and not any of it go to principal. There could be a combination of those things. You got, if you're repoing more and you've got a lot more, the age of your portfolio is not as mature, and so you're getting that. I would think that lines up with the other numbers.
Yeah. And I should explain that all the numbers that we look at in V8 are for banked or collected interest. We're not working with any accrued values at all. We're just looking at what actually went in the bank. So now we start to get into the cash flow information. And we take a pretty simplistic approach. In fact, Nathan, as I work with these numbers, I remind myself again and again, I'm so thrilled with how much information that we're able to glean from a small batch of numbers. As a dealer yourself, you turn in your numbers. I think we're at about 25 numbers that we capture from each dealer each month. How long does it take you, just generally speaking?
I mean, total from pulling the reports to inputting it, maybe an hour, maybe, 45 minutes is probably somewhere in there. Yeah.
Good. Yep. I think that varies by software, but I've had dealers say they can do it in 20 minutes or whatever. But, I've also had dealers that struggle with it just because their software is not great. And, we're not. So we have to support the dealers in finding all the numbers, and so this is part of what happens there. But I would say, I'm just saying that we're able to do a lot of calculations and ratios off of those 25 numbers, and it becomes a lot of really meaningful stuff. So I think this cash flow section is a good example. So for those not seeing the screen, the way we calculate cash flow is we look at interest collected, we look at principal collected, which gives us a P&I collected, when we add those two together. And that average for this pool in 2024 came out to, we'll call it 3.3 million. So dealers collecting about 3.3 just in P&I in 2024. And then their repo recoveries in 2024 were another 446. That's a whole conversation about whether to treat repos as cash. I mean, we do for the purpose of this calculation, because in our way of thinking, whether a dealer liquidates that car at auction or, a wholesale car, you bring it back in, you stock it in at $3,000 wholesale value, whether you liquidate that car then at auction, Nathan, or whether you put it back in your inventory, it's effectively a credit toward your inventory. It's cash you didn't need to spend at the auction. And so we treat it like cash for that purpose. And so that's why, it shows up in our cash section there. So the total cash yield then on average in 2024 came out to 3.7. Call it 3.73 was the number for 2024. And then the way we arrive at a cost of replacing inventory, we have the dealer's volume. We know the average cost of car. We know the down payment of what has sold. And so if we treat it like the dealer is always going to replace the units that have sold in the interest of maintaining the same inventory level, that's how we arrive at an approximated cost. I have it here as kind of an estimated inventory replacement cost after adjusting for the down payments, because we don't create a separate line item for down payments. We just adjust it from inventory. So you're really looking at roughly a cash in deal number. And those dealers averaged in 2024, 2.18 is the number on the screen. That was the cost. So dealers averaged in 2024 net cash flow before operating expenses. This is important. This doesn't include operating expenses. So dealers could go back and look at these own kind of numbers for themselves and get a feel for what, how that looks like in their own operation. But at 1.54 basically is our number after adjusting for the cost of replacing inventory. So all that's left to pay out of that really is going to be, we have our, your interest expense on a line of credit, or any kind of outside debt, external debt would be in the expense side, obviously. But if we have 1.5 in cash flow, then we're going to cover our expenses. And if there's money left over, we could, in theory, reduce our debt, or we could go on vacation, or, that's effectively would be cash in our pocket after we took out operating expenses. So this is the part we don't have a consistent method, and we don't validate operating expenses in V8. We just chose to keep it super simple, and that's one of the ways we do it. And so we don't lean on that number in our V8 summary. But your thoughts about those numbers?
No, I like I like how the cash flow works. I think repo recoveries are absolutely looked at as cash. I know I see it that way. I can recondition this car and I didn't have to buy it again. Sure, that's money.
Yep, that's cash. And so just jumping ahead then to the numbers for 2025, that bottom line number, net cash flow before operating expenses in 24 was 1.55, we'll call it. And in 25, it came out to 2.21. So an increase of almost $700,000. So, that's pretty substantial. So here we talked about all these, these profitability numbers are down, sales might be down. But in reality, our cash flow in 25 was better in this pool of dealers. And I'll just quickly note the repo recovery number was only up from 446 to 590, call it 591. Right. So not a huge difference. It doesn't make up for, and at a glance, it looks like P&I was up from 3.2 to 3.8. So, dealers collecting more. So it looks like, we might not have been selling as much. We were able to focus on collections, and even despite having the higher charge-off experience, we still managed to bank more money year over year. So I think that's an important thing to think about. And it's an illustration of how our business is just different. I mean, you finance a car today, Nathan's got a 3-year tail on it. You have profit this year, and the charge off for that car, if it does repo later, you hope it doesn't happen in year 1, right? And so it's a tale that we deal with in our business that a lot of businesses don't have to contemplate. And so it's part of what happens here. Now, another example would be adjusted gross profit. So Michelle, do you mind putting that number on the formula or the explanation on the screen down at the bottom of our banners? Adjusted gross profit is basically gross profit plus interest income minus your net charge-offs. So the way I ask people to think about this is basically all the quote front end buy here, pay here profit, or lease here, pay here profit in your business before operating expenses. All right. So when we look at that number in 24, it came in at an average of 2.08. And in 25, it came in at 1.95. So, a decrease of about 6% on profitability. But so just right there on a single sheet, you can see that, cash flow and profit aren't always in the same conversation. They're not timed the same. And so we have to kind of be watchful about that. And then the last one I have is interest coverage. So this one is one that, and there's a form on that one too, Michelle, if you don't mind sharing that one. Interest coverage is a pretty significant one. I would say it's one of the go-to calculations for us. We track this on a rolling basis, on a year-to-date basis. And this is an important one for a lot of lenders to consider, because it's really a pretty good, if you had a one go-to metric on your portfolio health. A lender likes to see interest collections cover the cost of losses. So in this case, net charge-off. So that's our formula on interest coverage, is how much interest did we bring in? And in that same time period, what was our net charge-off experience? Did the interest that we collect cover our net charge-offs? And you think about, Nathan, in our business, one of the reasons you as a dealer have to charge more than Capital One has to charge a prime borrower is because you have higher risk. You can anticipate higher losses. That's why the interest rate is higher. And so when we look at interest coverage here, we're looking at, did that interest cover our losses, yes or no? And on average, our dealers actually, despite the heavier charge-offs, they averaged in a positive number. So in this case, you'd be looking for 100% or better. If you were, it's because we're looking at it as a percentage, you would want to cover 100% of your net charge-offs with interest. And so at this case, it came out in 24, it came out to 128.3% on average. And in 25, it was down to 123, but still positive. We're still above the red line, so to speak, in terms of interest coverage. So, it's just it's meant to give a wide look. I think, this is something that we're just trying to give folks a feel for what is really changing. There's a lot of chatter. You see a lot in social media. There's a lot of, kind of end of the world kind of, terminology. Sometimes people are just really frustrated. And if you're in it from day to day, sometimes it can feel like you're having a tremendous amount of charge-offs. It feels like you're really getting beat up. And on any given day or week, it can be that way. But when you look at it in a broader picture for us here on 25 over 24, it's a mixed picture. It's, profit was one thing, cash flow was something else. And then this last one is a pretty good indication of portfolio performance. And we were only down slightly year over year. So, and I would say, everybody says, oh, charge-offs were terrible in 24, and they were, and then they were worse in 25. And so, but for our pool of dealers, the average was above the line. So, it's apparently not as bad for everybody. Now, in fairness, I can say that, just like I always used to say about going to conferences, Nathan, it has been my experience that the people who go to the conferences and the ones who sit on the front row are sometimes the most successful dealers. Why? They're the ones who are most interested in comparing KPIs. They're the ones who are interested in education and learning and make sure they stay caught up on all the stuff, compliance and otherwise. And so I think there's a chance that this V8 pool is something similar. Dealers who are in V8 are the ones who are attentive to their business. They're looking to make sure that they find ways to identify tips and ways to improve. So there's a chance that this pool represents that. We don't have any way to know that for sure, but I would say that's part of what we have to consider as we look at this. Is these are dealers who are at some level interested in improving their business, right? So,
yeah, and I think it sets it's the mindset of the dealers who are part of these groups would yeah, I see what you're saying. That's interesting. That makes sense.
Yeah. And I think we saw some of that in our conversation last night. And we, as we've started the new year, we've just kind of been doing a little bit of a reset and check with all of our members, because we know when people, as these dealers, make time to show up for these meetings or contribute the data that you're sending in every month, and then you give time to sitting in the meeting, then we want to make sure that it helps you move the needle. that we can see improvement in the numbers at the areas that matter most to you. So I think part of what we're doing and that you're helping us do as COO is, work through these kind of check-ins with dealers, see where we're at, find out exactly where we can add more value. And it's not all just in the data, but certainly we feel good about the data that we've compiled and just continues to build. So.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I would say, as in any organized business, you go through different phases. I was part of the original beta group. It was 3 of us, right?
Yeah.
We were just happy to have a bunch of guys that we could get together and have a common conversation about,
Right.
and be open with, and have some confidentiality. And then as this virtual groups have sort of taken off and matured, I think now you're dealing with lots of different folks at different stages, and I think that is impacting our need to change as well. And the real challenge for us is going to be making sure that we're connected to our dealers and understand what they need, and then
Right.
be able to deliver that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we accept the challenge, and we're looking to, we're 2 full years now in on our data, and so that's meaningful, and we're learning more about what works and what doesn't work in our virtual format. But yeah, I hope what we shared here today is useful, and I think about those dealers that are out there and just don't have a real good point of comparison, and they don't know, kind of what is possible, what are people doing, and so hopefully this kind of gives at least one point of reference. And obviously, we would love to invite folks that are listening to jump in and be part of one of these groups. We group our dealers we basically set our grouping by number of accounts. So we've got 100 to 500 accounts, and then 500 to 2,000. And so we just kind of drop people in groups based on their portfolio size, and that's some reflection of the stage of their business. So again, reach out if you want to be part of a V8 dealer group. We'd love to hear from you.
absolutely.
Thanks, Nathan. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, guys.
All right. See you soon. Stand by just a minute.